Hello, I'm Mercedes Stephenson, and this is the West Block: politics, perspectives, and players. Seafood supplies are dwindling at a much faster rate than scientists originally predicted. A new study looking at marine life from 1930 all the way up to 2010 shows a reduction of just over 4% of harvestable sea life. That's about 1.4 million metric tons of fish. And the areas hardest hit: the Northeast Atlantic Ocean and the Sea of Japan. Those areas saw a 35% decline. Joining me now from Princeton, New Jersey is Olef Jensen. He's the co-author of the study in question and the director of the Center for Fisheries and Ocean Sustainability at Rutgers University. Olef, were you surprised by the results of this study?
I think we were all surprised to see that there were both winners and losers in terms of the fisheries being affected by climate change. And globally, they were balanced, but within individual regions, the effects were not at all balanced. Some of the regions are seeing very large declines in productivity.
One of the declines you talk about is that 4% drop in sustainably harvested foods. What does that mean in terms of consequences?
Well, that has serious consequences for fishing communities that rely on these fish for their livelihoods, as well as many parts of the world where seafood is not just a delicacy, but it's protein that people need to survive.
And I know we all enjoy fish here in North America, but for some cultures it plays a pretty significant role in terms of what they eat and how much they eat. So for people around the world, what does it mean in terms of their food security if they're not going to have the same level of access to seafood?
That's right. I think one of the really worrisome things that we found was that East Asia is one of the regions that has seen some of the largest declines in productivity. And East Asia is a place where seafood is extremely important for nutrition and for food access and nutrition in many of those communities.
What do you think is the biggest factor in why we're seeing this kind of a drop?
Well, I think that what we've seen is that some fish populations can benefit from warming up to a point, but what we've seen here is that many of those fish populations have been pushed past that point. So past the point where they benefit from warming and into the point where it really negatively impacts their productivity.
And what happens, as a non-fish scientist, those waters, sure, warm waters for humans sound great to swim in. For fish, though, obviously, it takes them outside, I guess, of the range that they're able to live in. What happens to those fish when the oceans get warmer?
Sure, yeah. Warming actually raises their metabolic rates. And so a little bit of increase in metabolic rates actually helps them grow faster if they're able to keep up with it by eating more. But at a certain point, warming raises their metabolism to the point where they're actually not growing as well and not surviving as well. And that's when we see the loss in productivity.
You looked at a pretty substantial range in this study. You looked at marine life all the way from 1930 to 2010, incredibly comprehensive. But given the reports about what we've seen in weather and climate change in recent years, do you have any sense of how the seafood supplies might have changed in the last 9 years since your data for the study cut off?
That's right. And I think there are some interesting examples there where our results are already somewhat out of date. For example, in the Northeast U.S., northern shrimp have seen additional warming past the end of the data in our study, which has led to declines. They were winners during the period that we looked at, but they've since gone past that peak and seem to have been losing out as a result of increased warming.
I'm curious to know, what other trends did you find in your study when you were looking at these seafood populations and temperatures?
Sure. So one of the patterns that we found is the stocks, the species that were most vulnerable were those that had also experienced overfishing. And so when we think about what we might be able to do in terms of dealing with these consequences, one of the most important things we can do is to avoid overfishing in the first place. That will help the stocks remain resilient to climate change to a much greater degree.
I'm curious to know, how does that work? Because you think, okay, overfishing, you take the fish out. Why do they benefit when there's more fish rather than not enough fish?
Sure. So overfishing changes the population structure. It changes the populations to have more young individuals than older individuals. when you've got some older individuals in the population, you can survive a couple bad years. But if it's all young individuals, which happens when you've got dramatically overfished populations, each year is critical. So one bad year has a severe negative effect on the population.
What are the challenges to try to stop that kind of overfishing? I mean, I know, for example, in Canada, we have Fisheries and Oceans that enforces a lot of it, and it can be quite strict in the ability to patrol with drones and everything else, and you have to report back with how many fish. But obviously, it doesn't work like that all over the world. So is there a strategy you have in mind, and how difficult will it be to implement that?
That's right. I mean, Canada is one part of the world that we consider data rich. So there is a lot of science that helps with management. But in many parts of the world, fish stocks are managed without the benefit of scientific surveys. And in these parts of the world, there's a variety of strategies that work. Marine protected areas are often a bigger part of the fishery management scheme. And those can be quite effective if they're well funded and administered.
If nothing is done and they don't stop overfishing and climate change continues on its same path, where do you see the future for seafood and oceans in the next 10 to 20 years?
Yeah, I think if warming continues and we don't see better fishery management, I think even some of the stocks that the populations that we've seen that have been winners so far will stop being winners and will become losers. The ones that have lost productivity already are going to just get worse. And I think we'll see increased fishery conflict in areas of the world where many of their important fisheries are losing productivity.
I know your study looked at a couple of particular areas, including the Northeast Atlantic Ocean and the Sea of Japan as being particularly affected by climate change. But are there other areas, other oceans that you're looking at, or parts of oceans that you think are significantly at risk?
Yeah, East Asia really stands out as a place that has experienced many populations at the same time that have lost productivity. In contrast, the Northeast U.S. has seen some populations that have actually benefited, and black sea bass is a very good example of that. That's a species that's shifted its range, and we think has found new resources that have enabled it to remain productive despite warming.
Have you found that there's particular species that are being most affected, for example, salmon?
Sure. Yeah, we found some of the cod stocks have been dramatically negatively affected by warming, and the species that's the biggest winner so far is black sea bass.